Today we have Amanda Huffman with us. She is an Air Force veteran, which she did civil engineer. She deployed to Afghanistan with the Army doing a reconstruction team in Afghanistan, but she left the military in 2013. Her husband is actually currently serving in the U.S. Space Force, and today she actually hosts the Women of the Military podcast, sharing the stories of women who have served, and is the award-winning author of A Girl's Guide to Military Service, a guide for high school girls considering the military, which I think is so badass. So, Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So, Amanda, let's start off with just your military service. So, you went in as CE, which honestly, my husband joined as CE when he first joined, or when we first joined, and that is a very male dominated career field. So, what made you, one, decide to join the military, and then one, decide to do CE?
So, September 11th happened, my senior year of high school, and I was kind of lost and didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I had really had no direction. I knew that my dad was like, "You have to go to college," and so I knew I was going to go to school, but I didn't really know what I was going to do. And so I went to the community college in my hometown because it was cheaper and it was just a better fit, and especially for someone who was lost and didn't know what they were going to do. And I met a group of friends, and a bunch of us were joining the military. One was doing ROTC, one was in the National Guard. He was being activated, and then I had 2 or 3 friends who were enlisting in different branches. And so I started looking into it, and I was getting kind of serious about joining the Air National Guard in my hometown. And as I was going through that process, my friend was like, "Before you enlist, you should talk to me about ROTC and being an officer." And I was like, "I don't know what language you're speaking, but okay, I'll have lunch with you." And so we went to lunch at Taco Bell, and he told me about ROTC and what it was and how I would be an officer and why that was important, because I was like, "And your point?" And so, especially like, you can go to school, get your college paid for, and then when you graduate, you have your degree, and then you join the military and you're an officer, which I still didn't understand what that meant, but it sounded really good because my main delay for like going to the guard was I was going to do avionics, and like, so I had 6 weeks of basic, and then the tech school was like 6 months long. It was so like, depending on when I left for basic training, I was going to probably miss like 2 school years, or like, because of the semesters. And so I was like, it's kind of like off track my plan to go to school, and like, going to school is really important. And so when he told me about that, I went to the open house that happened to be in the spring. It sounded really good. My parents went with me. And then I was able to stay at the community college and do the ROTC thing at the 4-year university. So I wasn't on scholarship. I was just trying it out. That was even better. I just got to try it out, see what I thought, and I ended up loving it. And that was how I joined the Air Force. And then one of the senior cadets was an electrical engineer, and he was like, "You shouldn't do it," because I really liked math and science. And he's like, "Math gets like more theory the higher you go up. Do you like math theory?" And I was like, "No, I don't like." He's like, "Hands-on math is engineering." He's like, "Don't do electrical, it's really hard. Civil is probably the best for you." And I didn't even like think about it. I was just like, "Okay." And that's what I did.
Nice. Okay. So you went the ROTC route. I did the enlisted route. So I joined like right after high school, but it was also because someone mentioned the ROTC. I also didn't know what it was. And at the time, my dad was like, "Well, you're never going to join if da 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 da." And granted, he never joined the military. So I don't even know why I was listening to, his advice. But yeah, as, a high school individual, like I had no idea about ROTC. So I was like in a very similar boat as you, but I'm glad you got that education or like that, knowledge of that ROTC route, because I do tell people, that officer route, it is nice. You get your education paid for. So I know CE as the enlisted side because, like I said, my husband was CE. So how does it work with officer? Like he was electrical, so he was an electrician. So as a CE officer, are you in charge of everything? Do you have like a certain shop you oversee slash lead? Like how does that work as far as like officer side?
So it's kind of weird because like the ops commander is, like there's the commander of the squadron, and then there's like an ops commander, and they're in charge of, the enlisted people, the plumbers, the electricians, the dirt boys, like all the people who work in the shops. And then there used to be environmental. I don't think they have environmental anymore, but the way and they would like move the officers around to different things. And so as a lieutenant, I worked in the environmental, and then I worked in the engineering side. And so I worked with the engineering assistants, and then I worked on like the projects. But as when I was like first in and they didn't know what to do, like they just wanted us to get to know the squadron, they would be like, go hang out with the dirt boys for today and like see what they're gonna do, or go hang out with the structures, they're building something. And so I got to do all these, like I got to learn how to use a front end loader. I helped build a CMU wall. We got to do like all kinds of crazy things, and they would just be like, you're a lieutenant, go do this thing. And so it was kind of a fun career field to be in as a lieutenant and to do all the different things. And then like my day job was like helping to manage the different construction projects on base. So I worked more with like the contractors, and then like the civil engineer enlisted troops worked on like the maintenance stuff more than like the brand new buildings and that sort of thing.
Okay. You also deployed to Afghanistan as doing a reconstruction team. Like, how was that as an officer, and let alone a woman in the military?
Yeah, it was an interesting experience because we were in Afghanistan as a civil engineer. They kind of look at as engineers in Afghanistan as doctors. That's kind of how, like how Americans, like doctors, a really big deal. Well, being a doctor is a big deal in Afghanistan too, but like being an engineer is on par with that. And so they kind of looked at like me as a third sex. That was how the Afghans that I worked with talked about it. It was like, you're a woman, but you're not really a woman. There's like, Afghan women, American women, they're not the same. And so that's like kind of how I think they culturally got around working with the women that they had to work with. And luckily, I was deployed with another female engineer, so they only had 2 women engineers to work with. So I think it would have been a different dynamic had it been, you know, a male and a female, but we were both females, so that worked out really well. And then being deployed with the army was interesting. I was attached to an infantry unit, and I didn't really understand like combat exclusion and how it worked until like now that I'm out of the military and combat exclusion is lifted. So I didn't realize like that I couldn't be in the infantry and that I was going on all these missions, and this was kind of crazy. I was just doing my job. So I don't think I thought about the dynamics of like what it meant to be doing the work that I was doing, but it was crazy because we were going off base and helping the people. I was like managing the construction projects the way I was on the base, but this is like with the Afghan people in Afghanistan.
Did you see like any like challenges being a woman in like a very male dominated career field stateside?
I mean, I've I feel like I had really good commanders who didn't really care that much about our gender. It was like about the capabilities, like you're an engineer, you can do this job. And like when I got tasked on the PRT, no one talked. I mean, they sort of like, you're a woman, but it was like you're also a body. We don't really care. And so I feel like I was really lucky, and I didn't really face a lot of challenges. I only had like support. So I didn't it was like something that was talked about, but not something that I really struggled with, if that makes sense.
Hmm. That's good though. And I feel like, once women feel supported, it's a better uh, environment to work in. And then
Yeah.
they're more involved, even like post military service, because they have that experience and they want to share that and influence more the younger generation to come in, which is what you're doing with your book and your podcast. So, what made you decide to leave the military?
So I left the military after I got pregnant with my son because I was a civil engineer, and when I left the military, the ops tempo for civil engineers was 6 months on, 6 months off. You didn't deploy that often, but that was like the buckets. And so I knew that the likelihood of me deploying 6 months after I had my son or within the first year was really high. Now they've changed it. You have a year at home, but at the time it was 6 months. And I really the deployment was really hard. There was like a lot of challenges being with the army, and then there were a lot of team dynamics of like different people, backstabbing each other and like all kinds of stuff. And so it was hard to do without having a family at home, and just I had my husband, but he was on his own, he's fine. But like adding a child to the mix, it just felt overwhelming. And I felt that if I wasn't going to be ready to deploy at 6 months, then I should leave the military. And so that was why I left. I didn't really want to. It was really hard to leave because I really loved it, but I also felt like I wasn't gonna be mentally ready to deploy and leave behind a 6-month-old.
So I know, like you said, like the standards kind of changed. You have like a year. Did you mention to your leadership that you wanted to stay?
No, because it wasn't really like an option at the time. It was like, this is the way the rules are, and there wasn't like my leadership, there wasn't anything they could do because like the deployments came from higher headquarters and then down, and it wasn't, I don't think they really had control, so it wasn't like something. And I made a list because my husband was active duty, or still is active duty, but we were dual military, and so it was really challenging like in the future of trying to figure out like where we're going to be stationed together. We didn't even know the
Mhm.
Space Force was going to be a thing, so like there was like all these reasons of like why I should get out of the military or he should get out of the military, and then there were like two reasons. I really like this job. I really want to stay in. And so it was more like a personal discussion with my husband and like figuring out what was right for us. And I think the deployment factor, because my husband's in a career field that doesn't deploy at such a high rate, really helped influence like me to be the one to get out, because even if he had gotten out, that 6 months post baby deployment window was still going to be there.
Mhm. How was it being like dual military, and especially with you having that 6 month on, 6 month off deployment bucket?
I mean, he was traveling a lot for work, and I was traveling like we didn't see each other a lot. We spent probably like we were on active duty 6 years together, and we probably spent about half of it apart with his traveling, and like I was gone for 15 months for my deployment between the training and the deployment, and then he had PCS. Anyways, it's very complicated. So we spent a lot of time apart, and so it was really challenging. We learned about communication. It's kind of funny to talk about like I feel so old when I talk about communication because we just used a cell phone, and like
Yeah.
Skype was like how we communicated. Now, you have FaceTime and all these things like right at your fingertips. And so it was a lot more, we wrote letters, sent emails. And so it's changed a lot, but it really helped us like learn how to communicate, how to keep each other up to date on like what things were going on in our lives, and giving each other time to like adjust as like life changed. And so I think it gave us a lot of tools for our marriage in the future. But I mean, it was complicated, it was hard, but it was also just like two, married people. We just, when he was gone, I did my own thing. When I was gone, he did his own thing. So it wasn't like the end of the world. It was just required a lot of communication.
So you're right. Like the generation nowadays don't know how hard we had it
Right?
back when it was just Skype and the time difference and stuff like that. Yeah, the generation nowadays you have instant access, if you will. But communication is always like such a big component in any relationship, whether it's in the military, out the military, and especially dual military. Like, what are some tips on strengthening communication?
I think one of the things is like allowing the other person to feel the way that they do, and not like judging them or shoulding them. Like, you should feel like you should be happy that I got this promotion, even though it means I'm going to be gone. Like, even like when you PCS, I feel like sometimes the military is like, be happy about this. And like, Instead, I feel like you need to, like, embrace the emotions that you have, and, like, you don't have to wallow in them and stay in them, like, but being disappointed and feeling that and being able to express that to your spouse, and then, moving forward, coming up with a plan, like, it's a bummer that we have to move, but we are moving because the military's making, so let's figure out how to make this, like, the best, instead of just being like, "I'm fine, everything's great," and inside everything's falling apart. And so I think having those open discussions about how you're feeling, how different things in military life make you feel are really important, and then taking time to connect in, like, a lot of men like shoulder to shoulder time, and a lot of women like face to face time. So you have to find like the
Mm.
balance between, like, we would go mountain biking together a lot, and so even though you're not technically shoulder to shoulder, but it's shoulder to shoulder time because you're both doing something together, but you're not like actively talking to each other. But then I wanted to go like to dinner and like sit across from each other and talk. And so finding a way to do like both things, and I'm a big proponent of like the love languages and figuring out what your spouse's love language is, and then doing the same thing, like someone's words of affirmation, figuring out like how to fill their cup, or if they're a quality time or whatever it is. And so I think is figuring out like what your partner needs from you, and then figuring out how to fill their cup. But yeah, I could go on and on.
Yeah, no, I love that you mentioned that because I read the five love languages like when I was a very like itty bitty airman. Like my husband and I like just got married, so that was like 10 years ago, and it is still, and even to this day, we still kind of talk about it. Like, okay, this is why I feel this way because I like words of affirmation, and then he's more of like the receiving gifts, and so like his is more of like cooking and stuff like that, which I don't like cooking. So it is true, like trying to find understanding, that love language. And even as like a leader or in like a leadership spot, understanding your troops' love language can play a huge role. Like I know love is a weird word when you're talking about like, supervisor troop, but understanding like how they feel appreciated can change like a huge dynamic with communication, which I feel like, communication is always a problem in the military, and let alone like any aspect, right? Like communication is always a problem, but like understanding people's love language can really truly like change a dynamic in workforce, and let alone like a supervisor slash troop relationship. And especially if you're dual to dual, like that I think is so important, especially if you're deploying and stuff. But you
Yeah.
decided to get out, so what were like some of the changes that you faced when you left the military?
I went from being someone who was sort of important to like not important at all is what it felt like. I told people I felt like I went from like my husband and I are like sitting in the front of the car, and like one person's the navigator, one person's driver, and like you would switch off. And then it was like I got out of the military and was like I wasn't even in the front seat. I was like way in the back. And nobody cared. That's what it felt like when I left. And so it was a really hard transition to stay at home, and my husband also left for training 2 months after my son was born, which everyone was like, "Oh, wait till after the baby comes." And I was like, "Why do people tell us that?" Because it was really hard to be alone for 2 months with a 2 to 4-month-old. And so, and
Mhm.
I was dealing with getting out of the military, and so there were lots of emotions. And then I just recently was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder from the VA, and so I had that going on. And so like everything was coming up to the surface, and I felt like my world, and I was like, why did I do this? But it got better over time.
Yeah, that is a lot. And I am glad that the military is working towards a longer postpartum period.
Yeah.
Um, because you're right, like being alone, like 2 months postpartum is rough, especially if the baby's not sleeping.
Mhm.
And say like you are a military at this point, a military spouse, depending on where you're at, do you have family around, do you have that support? So it is hard, it is
Yeah.
hard. So what are some things that you did to kind of help with those situations and help with those challenges?
I think at the time I didn't really know there were any resources that could help me. I just thought this is my life. I have to count down to the day that my husband gets back, and then he came back and it didn't really get better. Like, magic didn't happen. And so I just took it in stride and tried to get through each day. And then eventually I started to get help through a program called Celebrate Recovery. And so it's kind of like Al-Anon or AA, but Al-Anon is for people who are in relationship with people who are alcoholics or drug addicts. And so Celebrate Recovery is kind of like all of it combined, but it's for people who have hurts, habits, and hangups, which is pretty much everyone. We all have hurts, habits, and hangups. And so I was able to get help with going to those meetings, getting resources, and then talking to other people and learning and just, I don't know, I feel like I was in a really dark place, and it's kind of like I was in a dark room and I'd been in the dark room for so long that I just thought, this is the way life is. And then it was like I went and got help and I was like, oh, there's a light switch. You can turn on the light. You don't have to walk around in darkness. And so it was probably like a 2-3 year process of like figuring out and finding tools and resources. And then I went through counseling through Cohen Veterans Network in 2021 and was able to get help. And that was actually during the withdrawal of Afghanistan. So that was a great time to be going through therapy. And then I just got rated with the VA. So it's a long process because I've been out over 10 years. And so it's been kind of crazy.
How long did you decide before, like, I need to talk to someone?
I think my son was 1. He was 1 when we moved to LA the first time. And then in that year is when I finally started to get help and I started to talk to people and I learned about Celebrate Recovery. And the first time I was gonna go to, this is like how I tell this story because this is like how hard it is to get help. I knew I needed help. I knew there was something wrong, but I got in the car and I was like, I think I'm okay. I don't need to go. So I went back inside, and then the next week, it didn't go well, surprisingly. And so then the next week, I was like, "You're not allowed to talk yourself out of it. You have to drive all the way there." And so I put the key in the ignition and drove. Wasn't allowed to think about what I was doing until after I was there because it was really hard to get me in that first
Mhm.
meeting. But then once I went, I started crying at that meeting and I knew that I was in the right place. And so then it was easy to go back, but getting there was so hard. And so it took me a long time of trying to figure out, like, first to decide to go, and then I decided I should go, and then I was like, no, I'm good.
Mhm. I honestly feel the same way too. For me, I was also diagnosed with PTSD. And then I'm always like, oh, I don't need talk therapy. And I probably should go because you're right. Sometimes it is hard to take that first step. So, what was the hardest part for you? Was it being vulnerable? Was it just talking? Do you felt like, I don't need talk therapy. I'm fine.
I think it was admitting that there was something wrong on a public level because I feel like I had a lot of like pressure to be perfect and everything. You know, when you fill out the questionnaires when you come home, it's like it's not really hard to figure out why people lie on them because it's really hard to open up. And I did when I got home. I walked across a field and I thought it was a minefield. I knew it wasn't a minefield, but I also like was in Afghanistan and it was a minefield. And I told the check-in lady at my appointment, the nurse tech, I guess. And then she's like, you need to tell the doctor that. It's really important. And so, of course, I did. Number 1, it was a male instead of a female. And number 2, she had kind of like freaked me. And she had asked me the question. And I was like, why are you asking me these questions? And then not telling, hey, if she doesn't talk about the fact that this happened, then you need to question her about it. And so that was like another thing. And so I also went to the Airman Family Readiness Center, had like free counseling, and I went and I talked to someone when I got home because I was like, I feel like there's something wrong. And she was like, oh, you're fine. It'll adjust. And so then I also had the self-doubt that I was going to show up to this meeting or even when I went to Cohen's Veterans Network, I was afraid that they were going to be like, there's nothing wrong with you. Why do you think? Because that therapist. So there were a lot of different factors.
I have no words because I feel like that's one of the worst things that you could say to someone who's saying, I need help. Like,
Right.
oh, just get over it. So I don't
You've
know
been
if this
home for a week or two, things will adjust. That's what she said. And it really bothers me because I'm like, why like, I'm in this office, obviously there's something wrong, and to be like, your experience coulda and that was kind of the mindset, unfortunately. Women didn't have PTSD, me being in there saying, she's like, "Well, you're just adjusting to getting back." And so I took that and ran with it, was like, I'm fine," and then, like, as things showed I wasn't fine, it was really hard for me to overcome that.
So this was like post Afghanistan. And I know when my husband came back from Afghanistan, he only had like 2 weeks to adjust. And I know he saw some shit over there. 10, 11 years later, he's slowly talking about it. So I know he holds a lot of that deep down. But was that a very similar situation with you? You had like 2 weeks to adjust and they put you like back into the workforce?
Yeah, I don't even know if it's yeah, so well, they give you, like, 5 days to in process, and then you got 10 days.
Mhm.
But my husband was living in Ohio, and I was in New Mexico, and so I only got, like, a few days, and then I took leave, and then when I got back from leave, it was, like, back to work, and then also, I was PCSing to be with my husband. So it was, like, a little complicated in that sense, but yeah, it was not very much time. It was like, "You're back! Get back to work," and I mean, I think getting back to work is really important, but I think there should be, like, check-ins, at, like, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, not just, like, "You've been home for a day, how do you feel?"
Mhm.
I feel fine, and then it's like but really, like, you need to check in with people on, like, multiple occasions and not check in, like, have them fill out a checklist, but, like, have them meet which I know they don't have enough mental health providers, but, like, have them meet with a therapist and do, like, a 15, 20-minute intake in a safe space because I feel like they did that, but I didn't feel safe talking to the doctor, and so I told the person I did feel safe with, and then she didn't tell anyone.
What do you think, like, what would your suggestions be so to create that safe space? Because as you know, the suicide rate for veterans is very high. And I know we went from 22 a day to I think 20 now is the last I heard. So we're slowly getting down. However, it's still a huge topic. And I feel like it's because they don't have that safe space to, talk about it. Um,
Right.
what would your suggestions be on kind of creating that safe space?
I think that there's a big disconnect between like the Department of Defense and the veteran community and even I mean the VA's gotten a lot better, but like when I went when I got out of the military, they did a 2-hour talk about everything the VA has to offer. And recently I went to a training, I guess it was a year ago, about just VA healthcare. Not VA disability, just VA, and it was over 4 hours long, and I still had questions at the end of it, and so the fact that like I had like a 2-hour talk about everything from like graveside benefits to healthcare to disability to home loans, like everything. It was like one sentence about everything the VA, and I know they've changed since like I got out, but I feel like if there was a way to connect people, like a mentorship program, I think it would help veterans and it would help the people who are in. If you could connect people with veterans who have gotten out and it would also encourage veterans to get more involved in the military community and some sort of program where like I'm getting out of the military and I want to mentor people, so then they like create a database, and I'm trying to do something sort of like that with girls who are looking to join the military. I've created a mentorship program where they can connect with people, and that's like kind of the idea of like helping the next generation. It helps veterans because they're giving back, and that's really important to veterans, and then it also can help bring them into the veteran community because I think there's so many resources and tools in the veteran community that people on active duty have no idea. And then people on active duty also are so focused on the mission because they're so overworked and they're so tired that there needs to be a better way to support them so that they can realize the end is coming. Like, you need to know about all these tools and resources. I know I have a lot of ideas, but really the mentorship I think would be really helpful.
I love that idea. And I know you wrote a book about girls considering joining the military. So let's, talk about that. Why did you decide to write a book for that?
So at the end of my podcast, I asked people, why did you decide to join the military? And I ended up having a lot of young people start listening to the podcast, and I did like a roundup of all the advice that I didn't do all of it because there were too much. It would have been a really, really long podcast episode. So I picked like highlights from different stories, and it ended up being one of the most popular episodes. And so I realized, and I also saw one of the episodes I did was 7 things I wish I knew before I joined the military. And so I was looking at like the data analytics of what people were interested in, and I realized there were a lot of young people who were looking to join the military who had questions. And so I created a free lead magnet, like 10-page guide about joining the military. And then that idea, I put it out on the internet, and I was like, how do you find girls wanting to join the military? I don't know. And I just put it out there, and people started downloading it. And so I was like, there's an interest. And so then the book idea came after that.
So what were some of those like key findings that you found from like doing all that analysis?
Sometimes I got a chance to talk to the people who downloaded the guide because they would email me and ask, because I added them to my email list, and then I would ask them questions, and sometimes people write back and sometimes people don't. But I heard from multiple young women that they weren't getting support from family members. They were like, you shouldn't join the military, or, even people who had been in the military, they weren't finding the support from those around them that they should do it. And so when they found my guide and they were like looking to join the military and someone was actually willing to help them, they were so excited and so thankful. So I realized, and even if I did like a Google search, there weren't any resources. There's like so much targeted to young men to join the military, and I think the fact that we have like 20% approximately women serving with like no recruiting for women is like amazing. And so we have a recruiting issue. Why aren't we targeting 50% of the population and women to join the military? And so that was kind of my idea on like why we needed it, because it is really different to serve in the military as a woman, and I don't think people focus on that. Like there's books like Join the Military, and then there's a chapter by a man written about what it's like to be a woman, and if you read that chapter you're like, no, that's not that's not what it's like. So I wanted a book specifically focused to help women, talking about like periods and being married, being a mom, financial decisions, like everything that you can put a spin on it for women and focus on like how it's different and how it affects your life. And so those are things I wanted to talk about.
Where can you find your book? Like I'm like so intrigued. I'm trying to download or myself.
It's available on Amazon. You can also get it at my publisher's website, elvarisa.com. And then I can send out signed copies too. So if you email me, I can send you a signed copy as well.
Yes, I would absolutely love that. And I will definitely put the link in the show notes as well for anyone who does want to purchase your book. So you also have a podcast. What made you, start your podcast, Women of the Military?
So in 2017, I participated in Write 31 Days, and you write every day in October. And I had done it before, but that year I was like, I'll interview people because then it won't be so complicated because I won't have to write. And I started working on it like well before October, and it was focused on deployments. And I was really excited, and I emailed a bunch of the guys I deployed with and some of the women I deployed with, and then I did like a thing on Facebook, like, here's a survey, please fill it out if you're interested. Well, almost everyone who wrote back and filled out my survey were women, and so I was like, oh, women in the military, and they had these crazy stories. The series is still on my blog if people wanted to go listen, or not listen, look at it. And so I learned like all these different deployments that women had done, like what it's like to be a woman on a Navy ship, and and then just like being an interrogator, being on an AWACS, all these things. And I was like, women in the military are amazing. So I was like, who cares about deployments? We're going to focus on women. And I originally was going to do another blog series, but my husband's active duty and we PCS'd in 2018, and I felt really overwhelmed in September while I was preparing for October, and my friend was like, why don't you just not do it, and maybe you could like start a podcast or something. And so I had women's stories that I had collected, and then I got to interview people. I used that as like my starting point of people to reach out to, and then I was gonna fill in the weeks that I didn't have guests with the stories that I already had recorded, but that never happened. I kept finding women. It wasn't as hard as I thought to find women to interview, and so I put all those stories in a book that's also on Amazon. It's also called Women of the Military. So that was like how it started, and then it's grown since then.
Yeah, I feel like once we give women that platform, more women are willing to like share our experiences because yeah, you're right. Only like 20%. Honestly, I think it's like 16% only serve active duty right now. And that's a very low number. And there isn't a lot of recruitment. I even know the Air Force didn't meet the recruitment, standards
Oh,
last year. So they, increased the age to get more people. And I feel like once, kind of like what I mentioned before, like once women feel supported in certain aspects, we're like, yeah, we're all badasses. Like, let's, women empower women. Let's share our stories and let's make some waves and show how amazing we are. So I love that you have the podcast. I love that you have the book. Do you plan on doing, I know your podcast is continuing, but do you plan on doing like another Women of the Military Volume 2, like a yearly thing? Do you want to do it another one down the line? Or are you just going to stick with
I
the podcast?
I had thought that I would want to do that, but I just really enjoy like the podcasting aspect and like sharing the story, and I could, work to get it all. It'd be a lot. It's not as easy as you think to take audio to make it into text. So I had thought about it, but right now I feel like a lot of people are listening to the podcast and it's getting a lot of traction. And I do a summary of the episode on my blog, so I have that as well. And I would if I was gonna write another book, it would probably be about like my time in Afghanistan and focus on like what that experience was like. And so I've tried writing it a few times and have stopped. And so we'll see like what happens. But right now I'm just want to keep the podcast going. And I love seeing that there's so many new podcasts by other women veterans that are focused on women. And so that's been really encouraging and inspiring too. So I just love that we're getting to tell the stories, because not only do I get to like meet women veterans who have become my friends, but I also have learned so much history of like women's, all the way back to Revolutionary War times, have served in the military in some capacity, and I had no idea the role and impact women have had to the military, and so I've gotten to learn all that, and that's been really, really, really exciting.
I think that's another thing that I really love about the podcast that I'm doing right now is because like I'm hearing all these stories and I'm just so amazed by some of these like experiences. And I think you totally should write a book about, being in Afghanistan. I think because we were there for so long that people kind of not forget, but like don't put so much emphasis, or it's almost like not a deja vu, but like I don't even know what the word I'm looking for, but just surreal. Like it's just like a surreal time because we were there for like 20 years, and especially with you being a woman in CE going with the army, I think that would just be an amazing, amazing book. And honestly, if you agree with me, comment on this. I think we should do another episode with her on just her deployment to Afghanistan because I think that would be so amazing to tell your story.
That would be fun. That would be fun.
So think about it. What is some advice that you would give those considering military service?
I I would say go read my book. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, no,
But
seriously,
really,
go read it.
I wrote the book so that you would have like all the information that I wished I had had when I was joining right in one place, so that you don't have to watch like 100 different YouTube videos, and still do that because I think that different perspectives are really helpful. But I wrote the book so that you would have like as much information, so like you would know about ROTC, you would know about different career fields, and you wouldn't just pick the one that the recruiter said this one has a bonus, you should do it. And so I tried to put as much of the things I wished I knew, and then as I was researching it, I learned even more things. Like, the finance chapter wasn't originally in the book, and then my husband was telling one of his coworkers about it, and he was like, "Oh, well, now that they changed the retirement and like so many more women get out before 20 years, it's actually like beneficial for women, and there's ways." And so I added a whole nother chapter about like how financial wellness is so important, and like why the new retirement system helps women in ways that, you didn't. Like, I got out at 6 years, and so I didn't get any retirement, but now that's changed. And so I think that having all the information is so important, because a recruiter's going to tell you what they want you to know, and sometimes they also are going to tell you things because that's what they think is true, but they might not actually know the answer because they're not a woman, they're not dual military. Like, I've had recruiters tell me, "Oh, well, I didn't know that because there's like, if you want to get stationed together, certain paperwork you need to do," and they didn't know that that was required. And so, like, I talk about things like that in the book, that there's just so many things that people need to know about, and just as long as you have like all the information in front of you, you pick what's right for you. Like, for some people, enlisting is the best path for them because maybe they're not ready for college, or maybe it's just not the right time for them, but enlisting can give you, access to a GI Bill and career field skills. And so it's not like, this is what I did, you should do it too. It's like, this is all the options laid out in front of you. Figure out what's right for you. Do you want to do active duty, National Guard, Reserve? Like, what do you want to do? What branch do you want to serve in? And so, yeah.
I completely agree with that, and I'm so glad that there is a resource out there. I know it's tailored to women, but I feel like a lot of that could even be applied to the male population. But you're so right. Like, when I was 18, again, I didn't know what ROTC was. I enlisted, and looking back at it, I'm glad I enlisted. Do I wish I ended up commissioning? Absolutely. But I didn't know those options. I didn't know what the difference between reserve, guard, or active duty was. Like, I had no idea. And then, you're right. There is the pros and cons for, each service. With, enlisted, I got my GI Bill. And, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. And the GI Bill has been allowing me to do that. And ROTC, you're going through college. So you still get that, college experience, which I personally never got when I was like young and dumb, if you will.
You
Like,
still get your GI Bill too.
okay, see, and I didn't even know that. Like, well, shit. If I could go back in time. So clearly, even if you've been in, if you do want to educate troops or educate people who are considering the military, clearly this book is for you. So please, 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 buy it and give to someone who is considering it. I know it's usually, a lot of people kind of, push women away from the military, but if, your daughter or niece or granddaughter is thinking about the military, it has been, and it sounds like you really enjoyed it too. Like, it's one of the best decisions in my life. And if you could give them that resource ahead of time, do it. You are giving them more knowledge and the ability to make better decisions for their life. So I love that you wrote that book. I'm gonna hype it up to everyone now because I I think it is such a needed book. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna add it in the show notes. So if you are interested, you could get it from her publisher or Amazon, which I'll include both, so you can purchase it. Amanda, do you have any closing thoughts on someone who's listening to this podcast, what they should take away from it?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that your story matters and that your story is important and people need to hear it. I think that's like my slogan for the podcast, like, your story matters, because at the time when I started the podcast, like, I had heard almost no stories about women who had served in the military, and I had no idea the challenges that women had overcome to get us to where we are today. And every story plays a piece in that. You don't realize, like, as you're serving in the military, you're just going about your daily life. That has an impact on not only yourself but like the next generation. And so I think it's just important to remember like how important your story is, how important it is to tell your story. You don't have to share it on a podcast. That might be overwhelming, but just telling your story to your family members, loved ones who can hear about your experience. And one thing I love to do, I have a 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, is going to their classrooms on Veterans Day and talking about what it's like to be in the military. I read the book Captain Mama, which is a children's stories about an Air Force navigator taking her son and talking to her son about her service. And so it's a great children's book to use to share the story and open up a door to a conversation. And so I think that's a great resource. But like, share your story, tell people that you're a veteran, wear the hats, even if you're going to get comments like, "Did you really serve?" Yes, I served. Be proud of it. And so, yeah.
Yes. I agree with that, which is why I do have an Etsy store where it says Women Serve Too merchandise. So if we want to be proud and loud, you guys head to my Etsy store, Women Serve Too. 10% is going to be donated profits to veteran benefited charities. So that's one
Awesome.
way that, we could give back. But yes, let's be loud and proud because we did our time just as much as the men do. So let's just be loud and
And
proud.
most of the men who are like saying the mean things, they didn't even serve. Like I've gotten so much support from male veterans, so like just just don't worry about like what other, it usually has more to do with them and then you. So just be proud of your service and don't worry about, I sometimes it gets frustrating, but I still think it's like so important to talk about our stories and just ignore the haters.
I know it's easier said than done, but you
I
are right.
know.
You're right. Like it's, just be proud. Like I said, we've done our time. We raised our hand. And like you said, a lot of it is people who coming from people who've never even done that. So
Right.
let's keep telling each other stories, sharing each other stories, and again, be proud of your story and your service. So I love
Yeah.
that. Amanda, if someone wanted to reach out to you, what are the best ways to contact you? Or how can someone find
So
you?
my favorite place to be is on LinkedIn. If you're a veteran or if you're serving in the military, you don't have a LinkedIn profile, you should. It's such a great wealth of information. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I gave you the link so you can put it in the show notes easily. And then I'm also on Facebook, and I don't know if we call it X or Twitter. I'm not really on there very much, but I do have a presence. And then you can always email me if you have questions at airmantomom@gmail.com. And I have a link to my waitlist if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast. So that's an option as well.
Yes, and I will include all of that in the show notes because I'm a very big supporter of female supporting females and female veterans supporting fellow female veterans. That's a mouthful. But Amanda, thank you so much for being on my podcast, being on Women Serve Too. Again, thank you so much. If anyone wants to reach out, please reach out to me or her. Highly recommend getting that book. All right. Like, I'm going to keep pushing it. So buy that book because even you could probably get some beneficial education out of it. Until next time, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.